For our last session, I'm once again going to recognize Sister Danielle Peters, who will preside over the session and introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon. Today marks the National Day of Prayer for Mental Illness Recovery and Understanding. And I would like to invite all of us now, before I introduce our final speaker, to turn to Our Lady, asking her intercession for the many afflicted by this illness and their caretakers by praying the Memorare together. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought thy intercession, was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, I fly unto thee, O Virgin of Virgins, my Mother. To thee do I come, before thee I stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not my petitions, but in thy mercy hear and answer me. Amen. I am pleased now to introduce the speaker of this conference's last presentation, Professor Astell. Appointed in 2007, Anne is a professor of theology at this University of Notre Dame. After serving as professor of English and chair of medieval studies at Purdue University. Her research focuses on medieval literature and spirituality. She is the author of 6 books, an editor or co-editor of 5 volumes on topics related to historical Christian spirituality. Recent publications include articles in Journal of Medieval and Early Modern Studies, Franciscan Studies, and in Contagion, Journal of Violence, Mimesis, and Culture. A member of the Secular Institute of the Schönstatt Sisters of Mary, Professor Astell currently serves as president of the International Colloquium on Violence and Religion and as president of the Society of the Study of Christian Spirituality. With this expertise, Anne will now share with us her reflections on remembering 1854 in 1958. O'Connor's edited collection on the Immaculate Conception as a sign of the times. Without further ado, I ask you to give your full attention to Professor Anne Astell. Anne?
Thank you, Sister Danielle. My talk has 3 epigraphs. So, the first from Matthew 16:3. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. The second from René Laurentin. The use of this epithet, Marian, is a sign of the times. And from Gaudium et Spes, the Church has always had the duty of scrutinizing the signs of the times and interpreting them in the light of the gospel. To commemorate the centenary of the Apostolic Constitution Ineffabilis Deus, promulgated by Pope Pius IX on December 8, 1854, an international symposium on the Immaculate Conception took place here at the University of Notre Dame, June 30th to July 2nd, 1954. Edward Dennis O'Connor, CSC, subsequently edited a collection of essays, The Dogma of the Immaculate Conception, History and Significance, which was published by the University of Notre Dame Press in 1958, the year that marked the 100th anniversary of the apparitions of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Lourdes, France. The volume thus conveniently honored Mary as the Immaculate Conception in a double sense, as the magisterium had defined the mystery, and as Mary had identified herself to the young visionary Bernadette Soubirous, whom Pope Pius XI had canonized just 25 years earlier on December 8, 1933, the feast of the Immaculate Conception. More than 50 years have passed since the publication of Father O'Connor's edited collection, and it remains the most cited, most comprehensive collection on the development of the dogma in the English language. Habent sua fata libelli. The ancient adage teaches us books have their own fates. These fates accord in part with the intelligence and the talent of their writers, with the multiple circumstances of their historical publication, distribution, translation, and reviews, and with the capacities of their readers, as Terentianus Morris's proverb, when quoted in its entirety, specifies, pro captu lectoris. The fate of O'Connor's book, published on the eve of the Second Vatican Council, gives us pause and commands our reflection. What are the factors, positive and negative, that explain its enduring authority and interest? What makes it, despite its now evident blind spots, one of the great Mariological books of the 20th century? In the immediate aftermath of the divisive vote of October 29, 1963, taken during the second session of Vatican Council II, René Laurentin published a critique of his fellow Mariologist in which he voiced two main complaints. First, the tendency in Mariology to close in on itself and cut itself off from the rest of theology, engaging in highly specialized and esoteric studies. And second, the lack of coordination of the mass of studies, so that isolated efforts are put side by side, but not organized to be of service to some enterprise in scale with the modern age. Neither of these criticisms justly applies to O'Connor's collection, which exhibits a systematic organization, interdisciplinarity, historical breadth and depth, and a conscious effort, as indicated in O'Connor's preface, to articulate how the Immaculate Conception of Mary stands, quote, in relation to the other mysteries of faith with which it has been associated in the divine plan, unquote. This desire for theological integration informs the Marian vision of its learned contributors, some of whom went on to play key roles in Vatican Council II, partly in creative tension with one another. Indeed, the international gathering of Mariologists represented within the pages of O'Connor's 1958 collection may be seen as a prelude to the Council, for which Pope John the 23rd would call on January 25th, 1959, just 1 year after the publication of the collection. Part 1, From the Collection to the Council. Contributing to the edited collection were 13 scholars, and I've given you a handout, and it includes some contributors' notes, so you can see that this really is an all-star international cast. 4 of this distinguished group of contributors were to play a direct part in the drama of the Second Vatican Council. Georges Jussard, Charles Journet, Carlo Balich, and René Laurentin. Jussard was consultor to the preparatory commission under the direction of Alfredo Cardinal Ottaviani. Journet belonged to the Theological Subcommission, chaired by Marie Rosar Gagnebet, which prepared the Schema de Ecclesia in advance of the council. A close friend of Jacques Maritain, Journet attended the third session of the council in 1965, during which he lent his strong support to the conciliar documents Dignitatis Humanae and Nostra Aetate. Pope Paul VI elevated Journet to the College of Cardinals on February 22, 1965. Balich had been instrumental in crafting Munificentissimus Deus, Pope Pius XII's Apostolic Constitution on the Assumption. He participated in the work of the prior subcommission for the council and assisted Pietro Parente as one of the 7 who prepared the revised schema on the church in 1963. Balich was the principal redactor of the De Beata section on the Blessed Virgin Mary, initially prepared as the 5th chapter of the schema De Ecclesia, then considered controversially for treatment as a separate document, and finally, as a result of a close vote taken by the Council on October 29, 1963, revised again for inclusion as Chapter 8 of Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the Church. Laurentin played a variety of roles at the Council itself and in its preparation. Before the start of the Council, Laurentin responded critically to the preliminary schema on Christian marriage, opposed Balich's proposed entitlement of Mary as Mater Ecclesiae in a draft early July 1961 of the Marian section of the Schema De Ecclesia, and offered sharp criticism of an early draft of the schema on the social order, De Ordine Sociali. Frequent in his attendance at the council, Laurentin published a chronicle of its proceedings. In April and May 1963, Laurentin belonged, along with Yves Congar, Karl Rahner, and others, to the so-called Belgian Squad, which prepared the revised text of the document on the Church. Together with Balich, Gerard Phillips, and others, Laurentin worked on the redaction of the final Marian chapter in Lumen Gentium, the role of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of God, in the mystery of Christ and the Church. Avery Dulles has called that chapter, quote, a skillful and prudent compromise between 2 tendencies in modern Catholic theology, one of which would emphasize Mary's unique connection with Christ the Redeemer, the other her close connection with the Church and all the redeemed, unquote. Anticipating that compromise, if we can call it that, and I'm sensitive to a question that was raised earlier in the proceedings, Edward O'Connor's edited collection of 1958 on the Immaculate Conception includes essays by Mariologists representing both trends. Indeed, O'Connor's preface to that volume consistently conjoins them, admitting no contradiction between them. The dogma of the Immaculate Conception, he writes, is, quote, of the highest significance for Mariology, first of all, but also for soteriology and ecclesiology, unquote. Our doctrine, he continues, is of the highest significance for the theology of redemption and of the Church, in which it constitutes a special chapter, unquote. Despite the both and shared by O'Connor's collection and the conciliar document, they have different emphases. Whereas Chapter 8 of Lumen Gentium enfolds Mariology into ecclesiology, placing the mystery of Mary at the heart of the mystery of the Church as its revealed archetype, O'Connor's collection on the Immaculate Conception tends in the opposite direction. It begins with Mary, with her Immaculate Conception, and extends into ecclesiology, a historical narrative of a mysterious, personal Marian redemption effected in, with, and through Christ. In his book, The Question of Mary, Laurentin succinctly expresses this contrast. Quote, from one side, the Church in Mary, from the other, Mary in the Church, unquote. Laurentin rightly rejects the labels of maximalist and minimalist that emerged in the polemics of the council, observing that, quote, a much more complex multiplicity can be observed in the thinking of the foremost Mariologists, and indeed, generally speaking, of the Council Fathers. This is so, he declares, because in different degrees, they were all trying to synthesize the two, namely the Christotypical and the ecclesiotypical features in the Church's Marian doctrine, which affirms both Mary's unique closeness to Christ, her special conformity to her divine Son through grace, and her cooperation with him in his saving work, and also her virtuous presence among the members of Christ's church, his mystical body. It is the resultant combination, observes Laurentin, which gives to each his particular outlook. Part 2, History, Mystery, and the Mediation of Grace. O'Connor's 665-page book is an edited collection of essays, not a monograph, but O'Connor has structured, introduced, and personally contributed to the multi-author volume in such a way that the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, history, and significance may indeed be said to have a particular outlook that holds together the Christotypical and ecclesiotypical features in a singular, specifically soteriological point of balance. A point of balance, to borrow Laurentin's term, that suggestively links Mary's then anticipated new titles as co-redemptrix and mediatrix to the Church's own mystery as a sacrament, a source of Christ's grace for the world in each of its ages, per secula seculorum. O'Connor observes in his preface to the collection, quote, there are strong indications that the Church is on the way toward a definition of Mary's co-redemption and mediation of graces, unquote. O'Connor clearly sees such a definition as a logical extension of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception defined in 1854, a dogma of structural importance, O'Connor argues, for the Church's self-understanding and for the entire system of the Church's faith. While O'Connor and the other contributors do not explicitly use the Council's language of mystery, pilgrim people, and sacrament to describe the Church per se, the collection's heavy emphasis on the long, rich, and complex history of doctrinal development, beginning with the biblical exegesis of the Church Fathers, is consonant with the call to ressourcement that animated the Council and actually performs, through the sheer fullness of its historical account, a narrative theology of epic sweep within which the mysteries of Mary and the Church are inseparably intertwined. As Journet writes in the lead essay for the collection, quote, the Church needs time, trials, challenges, the unfolding of history, its progress and catastrophes, that she may know, as it were, by inclination and effective knowledge, what she was when, in the presence of Christ, she was found entirely recapitulated in Mary, and also that she may know all that she is now through Mary, unquote. The subtitle of O'Connor's edited collection, History and Significance, announces its structure. Unlike other collections of essays, for example, those published in 2004 to mark the 150th anniversary of the definition of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, O'Connor's is, and I'm quoting from his own preface, not merely a collection of miscellaneous essays on the subject. They have been organized in order to provide not just interesting reading, but a useful tool, unquote. Following Journet's introduction, which thematizes the evolution of the doctrine from its hidden origins in Scripture and in the deposit of faith, are 6 essays that give a detailed account of different moments in that historical development. Jussard provides a patristic survey, inclusive of the early writings of the Eastern and West Latin Fathers. Zvornik focusing on Byzantine Mariologists writing from the 6th to the 14th century. Buhmann outlining the main trends within the liturgical tradition, from its first beginnings in the late 7th century in the Byzantine East to the Mass and Office of Pius IX, 1863, in the West. Balich tracing the medieval controversies during the time of John Duns Scotus, Sebastian giving a two-part history of the controversies from the death of Scotus to the end of the 18th century, and Laurentin delineating the successive papal decisions concerning the feast, the title, and the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, beginning with those of Pope Sixtus IV and ending with the bull of Pius IX, Ineffabilis Deus, 1854. Providing complementation to these historical surveys in Part 1 are the supplementary studies and appendices of Part 3. George Anawati's essay, Islam and the Immaculate Conception, Maurice Volberg's copiously illustrated study of the evolution of the iconography of the Immaculate Conception, translations of 5 short primary texts in the history of the Dogma, starting with an excerpt from the Proto-Gospel of James. These historical accounts, erudite, replete with extensive notes, are theological investigations, both because of the theological content of the studied sources themselves, and also because the essayists interpret those sources theologically as signs of their particular times and as witnesses to the operation of the Holy Spirit in the long historical life of the Church, in the East and in the West, in the liturgy and devotion, among the clergy and the laity, in argumentation on both sides of an issue, in public and private revelation, in interreligious and ecumenical dialogue, and in the actions and in the waiting to act of the magisterium. We are enveloped in mystery, writes Jossard at the end of his Patrology, a mystery that God allows our dull minds to penetrate slowly. Let us strive today to listen to all our brothers, including those of the Eastern Church, as well as the ancient fathers. Dvornik similarly concludes with a call for Western attention to the work of Byzantine theologians. Anawati, for his part, calls for Christian-Muslim dialogue, citing Mary's role in the mediation of graces to humanity and the reflections of the Christian faith in Mary, so mysteriously preserved in Islamic texts and in the hearts of Muslim believers. Given this attitude of appreciative openness on the part of the book's editor and contributors, the absence of any chapter devoted to the complex role of Protestant theology on the history of the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception and to Jewish-Christian historical relations is striking. The name of Martin Luther, who professed his personal faith in Mary's sinless conception, appears only once in one sentence in the O'Connor collection. Calvin's not at all. More than anything else, this absence, a limiting sign of the times, marks O'Connor's 1958 collection as a preconciliar work. If one judges by the titles listed in O'Connor's bibliography, 1830 to 1957, of books on the Immaculate Conception, published in 6 different languages, English, French, German, Italian, Latin, Spanish, one must conclude no substantial ecumenical work by Mariologists, qua Mariology, apart from the study of Byzantine sources, had been accomplished before Vatican Council II. The historical account, then, for all its richness, remains incomplete, both in its chronological range — O'Connor had originally planned to include an additional chapter — and in its ecclesial perspective. It is limited to qua history, because no history, even one theological in its narrative, can ever give a full account of its own significance in relation to what is, in the end, a divine mystery. The importance of any doctrine, writes O'Connor, does not lie chiefly in its history, but in its intrinsic significance as truth, and in its rank in the hierarchy of truth, which do not depend on historical contingencies. Therefore, O'Connor turns in the second and central part of the collection to 4 studies of the Immaculate Conception by dogmatic, we would say today systematic, theologians. Nicholas, showing the compatibility of the dogma with the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas when that teaching is viewed in its general framework. Mullany, linking the foreseen privilege of the Immaculate Conception to God's work of creation, redemption, and sanctification. De Koninck, spelling out the connections between Mary's Immaculate Conception and her other privileges, the divine motherhood, assumption, co-redemption. And finally, O'Connor himself, addressing the Immaculate Conception as the key to Mary's personal spirituality, both in itself and in its influence upon the spiritualities of others. What may we say about these 4 essays 55 years after their publication? De Konink's is the most typical of the Mariological writings of the 1950s, in that its logic operates within the confines of Mariology itself. The elegant essays of Nicholas and Mullany, both Dominicans, show the influence of a neo-Thomist scholasticism, confident in its synthetic powers, and eager to show the relevance of the Marian mystery to other mysteries of the faith. Mullany, for example, concludes his chapter with a bold consideration of each of the 4 Aristotelian causes of the mystical body of Christ in relation to the role the Immaculate Conception has in regard to that cause. A neo-Thomist theological investigation that hopes to yield some picture of the place of Mary's Immaculate Conception in the Church and its life. O'Connor's chapter on the personal spirituality of the Virgin is arguably the most proleptic of the set, reflecting the rising interest in mysticism, personal and communal, and anticipatory of the Council's charismatic description of the Church itself as corpus mysticum and mystery. Striking is the difference in theological style between the 7 historical essays and the 2 supplementary essays found in parts 1 and 3 on the one hand, and the 4 speculative essays in part 2 on the other. What gives coherence to the book as a whole, apart from the contributors' shared devotion to Mary Immaculate, is a constantly reiterated witness to and expectation of doctrinal development as a proof of the Holy Spirit's presence in and guidance of the Church in its understanding of Mary and thus of itself as Christ's bride. The historical theologians, on the one hand, bear witness to the long process of doctrinal development leading up to the definition of 1854. The dogmatic theologians, on the other hand, anticipate as a further development of the teaching on the Immaculate Conception the declaration of Mary as co-redemptrix, or mediatrix of grace. Since the definition, O'Connor observes, the meaning of the Immaculate Conception has been explored with greater profundity than before, particularly in regards to its relationship with other Marian mysteries. Alluding to the teaching of popes, fathers of the Church, and theologians that Mary is our co-redemptrix, Mullany expresses assurance that the Holy Virgin herself is a part of this mystery of redemption. Nicholas asserts it's easy to see how Mary, who is herself one of the redeemed, can contribute to the redemption of the human race. Indeed, the meaning of the grace of the Immaculate Conception would be incomplete if she did not. De Koninck devotes his entire essay to proving precisely this thesis. For his own part, O'Connor attempts quite a different theological investigation, a study of the spirituality of the Blessed Virgin, with reference both to her personal life and to the lives of others insofar as they are influenced by her. O'Connor conjoins these topics in part because his argument about Mary's inner life draws upon the witness of saints devoted to her, saints such as John Eudes and Louis Marie Guignon de Montfort, in part because any description of Mary's inner life, no matter how abstract, must take into account, quote, the maternal relationship that obtains between her and the entire mystical body, head, and members, unquote. Part 3, Marian spirituality, the Marian principle, and the modern ecclesial movements. The first pages of O'Connor's chapter on the spirituality of the Blessed Virgin may be described as neo-Thomist in their description of the harmonies obtaining between Mary's soul and body, among the faculties of her soul, and more broadly between her nature and grace. O'Connor then proceeds to supplement his Thomistic exposition with applications from the doctrine of classical mystical theologians, St. John of the Cross in particular, on the development of the life of grace and the effects of transforming union. Seeking to avoid the twin errors of portraying Mary as either too ordinary or too astoundingly miraculous, O'Connor insists, quote, Our Lady was, like us, subject to the trials and darkness intrinsic to faith and to the laws of spiritual progress through merit. The divinization brought about by divine grace in Mary did not detract from her humanness, unquote. Pointing out that Mary serves in the sanctification of others in two ways, as model and as helper, O'Connor concludes that the careful distinctions in his foregoing analysis fail to capture the dynamism of Mary's spiritual life as it affects the life of the Church. Quote, Seldom does piety distinguish between imitating Mary's example and invoking her maternal help, unquote. Rather, the mystery of Mary's holiness is such that the members of the Church are, quote, sanctified by contact with her holiness. This influence, moreover, is not a mere result of Mary's personal holiness, O'Connor writes, but a kind of participation in it. If O'Connor's edited collection attempts to balance the Nouvelle Theologie of historians with a neo-Thomism of dogmatic theologians, joining history with significance, its precise point of balance is perhaps best expressed in O'Connor's own essay, which combines, however falteringly, an abstract dogmatics with accounts of historical and mystical experience, virtuous action, and the witness of popular devotion. In O'Connor's portrait of the spirituality of the Virgin, of the Immaculate Virgin, Mary's inner life gives form to the Church's own. Hans Urs von Balthasar, whose writings exerted a major influence upon the Council Fathers, would later refer to this form as the Marian principle, which exists in polarity with the Petrine principle as a vital principle of the Church's unity. Voicing an insight later taken up by Popes John Paul II and Benedict XVI, Balthasar saw the Marian principle especially alive in the modern ecclesial movements, both those whose foundation predated Vatican II, for example, the Legion of Mary, the various Fatima associations, the Focolari, which is also known as the Work of Mary, and Schoenstatt, and those established in the wake of Vatican II's universal call to holiness, Lumen Gentium, chapter 5. In 1998, Pope John Paul II hailed the rise of these movements as, quote, one of the most significant fruits of that springtime in the Church, which was foretold by the Second Vatican Council, unquote. When Edward Dennis O'Connor wrote in 1958 about the faithful's participation in the spirituality of the Blessed Virgin, and thus in her holiness, he did not refer to any of the then existing ecclesial movements, although he was later to write extensively on the Catholic charismatic movement. An important link exists, however, between O'Connor's chapter in the Dogma of the Immaculate Conception and one of the major movements, L'Arche, founded in Troyes-les-Breuils, France in 1964 by the Canadian philosopher Jean Vanier. Among the French Dominicans whose writings O'Connor cites as providing a model for his own Marian investigation in 1958, he names Thomas Philippe, Jean Vanier's spiritual father, the man from whom young Vanier first learned, as he testifies, quote, the silence of prayer and the prayer of silence, unquote. Vanier had met the Dominican priest in 1950 at Lviv, an international center of spiritual renewal, ecumenism, and interreligious dialogue that Père Thomas Philippe had founded in 1947 in close proximity to Soulshire, the Dominican Priory and House of Studies on the outskirts of Paris, where Edward Dennis O'Connor was studying. Père Thomas had been sent from Rome in 1942 to Soulshire by the Holy Office as a visitator, charged with the unhappy responsibility to remove Marie-Dominique Chenu, a leader in the Nouvelle Theology and later Emeritus at the Council, from his post as Master of Studies, an office Père Thomas, still a young priest, then obediently, albeit awkwardly, assumed. Lviv was frequented by such figures as Jacques Maritain, Charles Journet, Olivier Lacombe, renowned for his study of Hinduism, and the Canadian psychiatrist John Thompson, famous for his role at the Nuremberg trials. Père Thomas Philippe was the soul of Lviv. As O'Connor writes elsewhere, the teaching of Père Thomas, itself a fruit of a profound personal mystical experience, had an extraordinary power to foster the spiritual lives of others. While a professor of theology and philosophy at the Angelicum in Rome, Philippe had spent long hours of prayer at the Mater Amabilis chapel near the Piazza di Spagna, where in 1937 he had had a mystical experience of profound union with the Virgin Mary, a transforming experience that affected his personality as well as the spiritual direction of others at Lviv. Accused of unorthodoxy and spiritual direction that was too mystical, and that's a quote, as Catherine Spink phrases it, Philippe, whom the Holy Office had used to remove Chenu, was himself removed from Lviv and Soulshire in 1952, sent into isolation, first in a psychiatric hospital and then in a monastery, and subjected to a severe period of ecclesiastical discipline, during the first part of which he was not permitted to celebrate Mass, hear confessions, or have any other form of ministry. Finally, in 1963, after 10 years of exile, Philippe, long attracted to the special presence of God in the poor and interested in psychology, was allowed to accept the position of chaplain at Val Fleury, a home for the mentally disabled in Troyes-les-Breuils, thus setting the stage for Jean Vanier's foundation of L'Arche there in 1964. The name L'Arche evokes both Noah's Ark and the Ark of the Covenant, whom Vanier, together with Père Thomas, identifies explicitly with Mary, Mater Misericordiae, who holds out her arms to embrace all the suffering of the world. The daily prayer of L'Arche asks Mary to bless the home of the mentally handicapped and of the volunteers who live with them, and to make it, quote, a true home, a refuge for the poor, the little ones, a refuge for those who are sorely tried, unquote. Père Thomas served as chaplain for L'Arche in Troyes-les-Brailles until his death in 1993. Today, as I'm sure you know, L'Arche and its affiliated organizations have family-like houses for the mentally disabled throughout the world and have made an important contribution to ecumenism. In 1958, however, Père Thomas still lived under the shadow of ecclesiastical censure. Given this history, O'Connor's repeated citation of Père Thomas Philippe's Treasures of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, retreat conferences transcribed, mimeographed, and distributed by the Sisters at the Convent of the Immaculate Heart in Notre, France, is remarkable. All the more so, perhaps, because O'Connor cites Philippe for the first time in an early footnote, together with Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, Philippe's teacher and former colleague at the Angelicum, who also wrote about Mary's interior life. O'Connor would later edit and revise an English translation of one of Philippe's retreat courses. In a foreword to that volume, Henri Nouwen mentions that O'Connor met Père Thomas already in 1948, 10 years before the publication of the Dogma of the Immaculate Conception. Father O'Connor knows Père Thomas in ways few do, Nouwen observes. For many years he has come to Troyes and listened to Père Thomas and let his heart be touched by him. This translation is thus the work of a true disciple, unquote. I would like to suggest that O'Connor's edited collection on the Immaculate Conception might also be described as the work of a true disciple of Père Thomas Philippe, whom O'Connor in a 1995 essay describes as, quote, a very competent theologian, formed in the Neo-Thomism of the French Dominicans between the two world wars, unquote. Neo-Thomist in his Mariology, Marian in his mysticism, Père Thomas had a heart that was drawn into the crucible of all the vital intellectual movements of his day, into the deep mysteries of human beauty and affliction, and the charitable practices demanded by them. O'Connor has similarly given us, in the many pages of the Dogma of the Immaculate Conception, a striking combination of dogmatic theology and narrative historical theologies, supplemented by interreligious and artistic expressions. The counterpose of these elements exhibits a creative polarity, but also an organic coherence that is attractive to anyone who has the patience to discover it. Perhaps this unity is itself an effect of a Marian principle, to echo once again Balthasar's phrase. Marian spirituality, writes Père Thomas Philippe, is characterized by a close union of doctrine and practice. It is objective because based directly on the dogmas of the Church, especially the two recently defined ones. At the same time, it is a spirituality of littleness, of personal intimacy with Jesus and Mary, and of service to the poor. Judging by this standard, O'Connor's edited collection is the work of a true disciple of Mary, dedicated, quote, to her whose heart, because untouched by sin, is both sanctuary of the Godhead and refuge of sinners, unquote. Having observed that Mary was enabled by grace to be more human than anyone else, O'Connor adds a thought-provoking footnote to his essay on the spirituality of the Immaculate Virgin. quote, "It follows that the development of Mariology presupposes not only a profound and rigorous theology of grace, as mentioned above, but likewise a rich and sure appreciation of human values," unquote. This sentence alone, and as you could see, I've been reading the footnotes, attests to the importance of O'Connor's book as a sign, prophetic indeed, of the times of its composition, those Cold War years on the eve of the Council, but also of ours, when not only human values, but even the value of the human per se, human life, human dignity, need the sort of affirmation that a developed Mariology can give them. Thank you.
Just a question, was that Père Thomas Philippe, Marie Dominique Philippe?
His brother is, he has a brother who is also a very charismatic.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
My question would be that Father O'Connor's formation, because he had a reputation, I recall, as being a superb scholastic theologian, and I just wondered what were the influences on him that opened him to some of the other developments. There's if those of you that read Crisis, the Protestant journal, they have a series of books entitled "How My Mind Has Changed," and they have theologians writing there, and I would just love it if Father O'Connell and all those who passed through all these enormous changes, who began as scholastics, would write, "How My Mind Has Changed." Thank you.
Yeah. I think my experience reading the essay on spirituality that he wrote, you almost see, the change taking place in a way, because he begins with the tools of Neo-Thomism, but then it's not complete for him, so he has to supplement it with John of the Cross and Louis de Montfort and others. And then in the end, he says, well, this doesn't quite match, what the experience of the church is, what the experience of the faithful. And so you can kind of see him in that single essay kind of working through, this particular combination, and then being so open, when the council concluded, to take on, the theological investigation of Catholic charismatic renewal, as did Cardinal Sunens, but I think actually the thing that we've been working with throughout these days has been reflection on the mystery of grace, right? The mystery of grace in Our Lady's life, and in the way that somehow we share in it.
Thank you so much for that amazing paper. And my question is more just wondering if you know whether Father O'Connor was he associated with Louis Boyer and having Boyer come to Notre Dame, and I know that Notre Dame Press published a lot of Boyer around this time period in translation.
I don't know that. I was privileged to have a little interview with Father O'Connor. I had some questions for him, and it was a very, very special conversation. But he doesn't really remember too much, of the details of, even some of the contributors. He doesn't quite remember how they got into the book, which is sad because it's really such a special book. But probably there'd be a way through other channels to track that down. Yeah.
In relation to Matt Levering's question, I suspect that most of the Bouillet volumes were translated and published by University of Notre Dame Press because of the influence of the great liturgical meetings that were held here at Notre Dame right at the end of the Second Vatican Council. Indeed, the entire doctoral program has its origins first in liturgical reflections that took place in the late 60s. That's an educated guess, Matt, not a definitive answer.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Sister Anne, for that fine presentation.